There's a generation alive right now that can tell you their attachment style before they can tell you their credit score. They know what a trigger is. They know what a boundary is. They've probably journaled this week. They've possibly cried in therapy about something that happened when they were 9, and they don't find that embarrassing to mention. They use words like emotionally unavailable and trauma response and nervous system in casual conversation, the kind of conversation that used to be about the weather. And here's what's interesting about all of this. It's not performative, not entirely. There's something real underneath it, a genuine attempt to understand the self, to name the invisible, to make the unconscious conscious. But spend enough time inside this world and a question starts to form. Is this emotional evolution or emotional overload? Because there's a version of this that looks like wisdom. And there's a version that looks like a person so deep inside their own head that they've lost the ability to just live. And the strange part is both versions exist, sometimes in the same person, sometimes on the same afternoon. So before we call this progress or pathology or a social media trend, it's worth asking a more important question. How did we get here? Because self-awareness didn't just appear, it was trained. To understand this shift, you have to zoom out, not to criticize, not to compare, just to see the cultural landscape clearly. Because what feels internal and personal almost always has an external origin. 20 years ago, therapy was something you did in crisis. It was private, sometimes stigmatized, and the vocabulary that came with it stayed inside the therapist's office. Words like projection and codependency and avoidant attachment were clinical terms, professional terms, not dinner table terms. Then something changed. The internet gave everyone access to psychological frameworks that used to require a graduate degree to encounter. Therapy apps made professional support available on a phone. Journaling went from a teenage diary to a wellness practice endorsed by neuroscientists. Mental health awareness campaigns moved from niche advocacy to mainstream culture. And slowly, steadily, emotional vocabulary entered everyday speech. People started naming their experiences differently. They stopped saying "I'm fine" as automatically. They started saying "I'm struggling" and meaning it. They started asking not just what happened, but why they responded the way they did. This wasn't accidental. It was culturally reinforced by content, by community, by the normalization of the idea that your inner life is worth examining. And that shift had real value, real, documented psychological value. Naming an emotion reduces its intensity. Understanding a pattern is the first step toward changing it. Removing stigma saves lives. But here's where it gets more complicated. When a skill gets culturally reinforced, when it gets rewarded and celebrated and turned into content, it doesn't stay a skill for long. And eventually, something changed. It stopped being a skill. It became something else. It became an identity. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. Watch how the language shifted. It stopped being "I went to therapy" and started being "I'm in my healing era." It stopped being "I need space" and started being "that violates my boundaries." It stopped being "I get anxious in relationships" and became "I'm anxiously attached." Stated not as something to work through, but as something that defines you. The healing journey became a brand. The inner work became content. The attachment style became a personality trait you list alongside your star sign. None of this is shameful. The impulse behind it is genuine. People are trying to understand themselves. They're sharing that understanding to feel less alone. But there's a quiet pressure that builds when awareness becomes identity. Because if your self-awareness is your identity, then being confused is threatening. Not knowing yourself becomes a failure. A bad mental health day doesn't just feel bad, it feels like a relapse, like evidence that the work isn't working, and the bar keeps moving, because there's always more to know, more patterns to trace, more wounds to name, more healing to do. The self becomes a project that is never finished. That's where psychology matters. Because real self-awareness isn't just vocabulary. This is important to understand, not as a critique, but as a clarification. Psychologically, self-awareness operates through specific systems in the brain. The prefrontal cortex, the region behind your forehead, is responsible for reflection, planning, and impulse regulation. When it's engaged, you can observe your own thoughts and feelings from a slight distance. You can notice a reaction before acting on it. This is called metacognition, thinking about your thinking. It's one of the most sophisticated cognitive abilities humans have. But there's another piece that often gets left out of the conversation: emotional regulation. Regulation isn't just understanding why you feel something. It's the capacity to tolerate the feeling long enough to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. It's nervous system stability. It's the body calming down enough for the mind to function clearly. And here's the crucial distinction. Insight is not regulation. You can have perfect insight into your anxiety, understand its origins, name its patterns, trace it back to childhood, and still be completely overwhelmed by it in the moment. You can know exactly why you pull away in relationships and still pull away. Knowing and being able to do differently are two separate capacities. They develop on different timelines, through different practices. Pause on that. Because if you've ever thought, I understand myself completely, so why do I keep doing this? That gap is the answer, not failure, not weakness, just the gap between insight and integration. And here's the part most people miss. Higher self-awareness increases rumination before it increases stability. This is documented, this is real, and it should feel like relief when you hear it. When you begin to develop genuine self-awareness, the first thing that happens is you start noticing things you couldn't see before: patterns, reactions, the distance between who you want to be and who you are in a given moment. And noticing that gap before you have the tools to close it feels worse than not noticing it at all. It's like gaining the ability to see clearly in a room that's slightly broken. Before awareness, you moved through the room without seeing the cracks. After awareness, you can't stop seeing them, and you don't yet know how to fix them. That discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It's a sign that awareness is working. The sequence isn't. Awareness leads to stability. The sequence is: awareness grows first, stability grows later. And the gap in between is where most people get discouraged and assume they're doing something wrong. They're not. They're just in the middle. But environment amplifies this effect. Because developing self-awareness in private, through journaling or therapy or quiet reflection, is one thing. Developing it while scrolling through a feed of curated healing journeys is something different. Social media didn't create self-awareness in this generation, but it shaped the texture of it significantly. The benefits are real. Mental health content reduced stigma at a scale no public health campaign could match. Millions of people heard language that finally described their experience. Community formed around shared struggle. People who would never have accessed therapy found frameworks that helped them understand themselves. But something else happened too. Healing became comparative. Timelines became visible. And that created a particular kind of pressure, the pressure to be further along than you are. There's also the matter of self-diagnosis. Short videos cannot diagnose. They can inform. They can point directions. But when someone watches a 45-second video and concludes they have a personality disorder, the result is often not more understanding. It's more anxiety dressed in clinical language. And then there's the subtler effect, the constant invitation to turn your inner life into content, to make your reflection visible, to share your realizations, to perform insight, shifts introspection from a private process into a public one. And what is performed is shaped by what gets rewarded. The feed teaches you which emotions are interesting, which insights are shareable, which healing looks like healing, and eventually reflection turns into something heavier. This is where it tips. You've probably felt this, even if you didn't have a name for it. It's overanalyzing a text message for 20 minutes trying to determine what the other person's tone reveals about their attachment style and yours. It's being unable to make a career decision, not because you lack information, but because you're waiting to feel fully aligned. Waiting for the choice that doesn't create any friction, which no choice ever does. It's replaying a conversation from 3 days ago, running it through every psychological framework you know, and coming away more confused than when you started. It's labeling ordinary stress as burnout, ordinary shyness as social anxiety, ordinary sadness as depression. Not because the labels are wrong, but because the labels have become the first response rather than the last. Psychologically, what's happening here has a name: rumination. Rumination is reflection without resolution. It's the mental loop that generates more analysis without generating more clarity. And it's different from genuine reflection in one key way: it doesn't lead anywhere, it circles. The problem is that rumination feels like reflection. It has the same texture. It uses the same language. It can even feel productive, like you're doing the work, while actually just increasing anxiety. And this is where many people get stuck, not because they're doing something wrong, but because the skill of awareness developed faster than the skill of letting things go. Because insight alone doesn't change behavior. This is the part of the conversation that rarely gets said clearly, and it needs to. There is a meaningful difference between knowing you have anxiety and acting from anxiety. You can observe yourself catastrophizing in real time, watch the thought spiral begin, name it, label it accurately, and still catastrophize. Because the nervous system doesn't respond to intellectual understanding. It responds to repeated experience. You can know your pattern of self-sabotage in meticulous detail and still enact it, not because you're broken or unaware, but because patterns are encoded in the body as much as in the mind. Their neural pathways deepened through repetition, and they change through repetition of something different, not through understanding alone. Behavior change requires two things awareness can't provide by itself: repetition and nervous system safety. Repetition, the practice of doing something differently, consistently, over time. And nervous system safety, the felt sense of being grounded enough to tolerate the discomfort of change without reverting to what's familiar. Insight initiates the process. It doesn't complete it. But here's what's also true. This generation also has something powerful. Because this isn't a generation defined only by what it struggles with. It's a generation that can name what it feels, and that is genuinely rare in human history. The emotional vocabulary alone represents a significant development, not just personally, but culturally. It's a generation more open to therapy than any before it. The stigma that kept people suffering in silence for generations is meaningfully weaker now. People ask for help earlier. That saves lives in ways that are hard to count but easy to see. It's a generation aware of patterns in relationships, aware enough to recognize dysfunction before it becomes decades of damage, aware of what it needs, aware of what it can and cannot offer others. The boundary awareness, when it's functioning well rather than used as avoidance, represents a healthier relationship with limits than most previous generations modeled. And perhaps most significantly, pattern recognition, the ability to see the architecture of your own behavior, to notice the recurring shape of a mistake. That capacity, when it leads to action, is transformative. These are not small things. The question isn't whether awareness is good. It's how it's used. In relationships, the benefits of emotional intelligence are concrete. People who can name their experience communicate more clearly. They repair conflict faster because they can identify what actually happened beneath the surface. They show up with more empathy, not because they're nicer, but because they have more access to the interior lives of others. They're better listeners, better leaders, more capable of genuine intimacy. But there's another side. Relationships require tolerating ambiguity. They require showing up before you feel ready. They require accepting imperfection in others and in yourself. And when awareness becomes excessive, it can generate a kind of paralysis. Overanalyzing compatibility before giving someone a real chance. Waiting for a partnership that hits every psychological marker. treating every moment of friction as a red flag, leaving relationships not because they're harmful, but because they're imperfect. Careers carry the same dynamic. Self-awareness supports purpose-driven work, clarity on values, recognition of strengths, early identification of misalignment. But the waiting for full alignment before committing to a direction, the expectation that a career should feel perfectly resonant at every stage, leads to stagnation more often than it leads to clarity. Discomfort is not always a signal to leave. Sometimes it's a signal that you're growing. So what does real self-awareness actually look like? It looks like a process, not a state. The model isn't complicated, but it is different from what most people practice. Notice, pause, adjust, move. Notice what's happening, the emotion, the reaction, the impulse. Not to analyze it to completion, just to see it. Pause before responding long enough for the nervous system to come down, for the prefrontal cortex to come back online. This doesn't have to be long. It can be a breath. It can be 30 seconds. Adjust, make a conscious choice about how to respond, rather than just reacting from the pattern. And then move, act, engage, live. Real self-awareness reduces friction. It doesn't generate more of it. It isn't endless analysis. It isn't labeling every emotion before allowing yourself to feel it. It isn't knowing everything about your psyche before you let yourself make a decision. It's the ability to pause briefly and choose. That's it. That simple, that powerful, and that distinct from what a lot of people have been practicing. And that requires a different shift, because the shift doesn't happen by accident. The first practical move is limiting mental health content intake, not eliminating it, but being deliberate about how much psychological input you're absorbing and from what sources. There is a point at which more frameworks don't create more clarity, they create more noise. The second is time-limiting reflection. Journaling has genuine value, so does thinking through a difficult situation. But giving yourself a container, 20 minutes to reflect, and then a deliberate shift, prevents reflection from becoming rumination. The goal is insight that ends, not insight that loops. The third and most important is pairing insight with action. After you understand something about yourself, ask immediately, what's one small thing I could do differently? Not a transformation, just a step. The gap between insight and behavior closes through movement, not through more thinking. The fourth is reducing comparison triggers. Being conscious of which content makes you feel behind in healing, behind in clarity, behind in your relationship with yourself. And reducing that exposure is not avoidance, it's environmental design. And the fifth is practicing regulation, not just reflection. Regulation is the nervous system skill. Breathing, grounding, movement, sleep, stillness. These are not soft suggestions. They are the infrastructure that makes all the insight usable. None of this requires a complete overhaul. It just requires a different orientation, and this leads to the real evolution. Self-awareness is not a personality. It's a tool. That reframe is quiet, but it changes a lot. Because a tool is something you pick up when you need it and put down when you don't. It serves a purpose and then releases you. It doesn't follow you everywhere asking to be used. A personality is something you carry all the time, something that defines you, something you have to protect and prove and maintain. When self-awareness is a personality, every moment of confusion is a threat. When it's a tool, confusion is just information. When self-awareness is a personality, not knowing yourself fully is a failure. When it's a tool, partial knowledge is enough to take the next step. The shift this generation needs isn't more insight, it's integration. Integration means the insight has been absorbed into behavior, not performed, lived. It means the understanding has moved from the mind into the body, into the habits, into the choices made on an ordinary Tuesday when no one is watching. That's where the real work happens, not in the reflection, in what the reflection changes. Let that sit. So here's where this lands. This generation isn't broken. It isn't too sensitive. It isn't weak for knowing the names of its wounds. It's in the middle of something real. A shift in how human beings understand themselves, one that's messy and imperfect, and sometimes excessive, the way all real evolution is. The insight is there. The vocabulary is there. The openness is there. What's next is integration. And that's not a problem with this generation. That's just the next step.